And I'd like to just begin by introducing myself. I'm Elizabeth Canuel, and I'm the chair of the Delta Independent Science Board. This is actually a meeting of our interview panel, so it's a public meeting that I'd like to call to order. Today, what we'll be doing is hosting a brown bag seminar for our first Delta lead scientist candidate. This is, sorry, excuse me. So as I mentioned, the interview panel has been leading the effort for the selection of the next Delta lead scientist, and this interview panel serves as an advisory committee with representatives from the Delta ISB, the Delta Stewardship Council, and the USGS. So we've been working on the recruitment for the next Delta lead scientist, who will be appointed by the council following a recommendation from the Delta Independent Science Board. We'll be interviewing 4 candidates for the position over the next few months. And for each of the interviews, we've invited the candidates to present a brown bag seminar that is a presentation of their research and experience and how it applies to the position, as well as some aspect of their presentation to deal with their vision for the Delta Science Program. So following the seminar, there will be a meet and greet opportunity to ask general questions. And we view this as an important part of the process and are happy to have you engaged in the process. So just a little bit of logistics. Please silence your phones. If you need to use the restrooms, take one of the keys that are just outside the room, and the restrooms are to the left and down the hall. So I'll begin with a roll call of the interview panel. So we'll start with Steve Brandt from the Delta Independent Science Board.
Steve Brandt, present.
Tracy Collier.
Present.
Susan Tatayan. Here. From the Delta Stewardship Council. Mike Czajkowski from the USGS.
Yeah, Mike Czajkowski here.
And then we have Jessica Pearson, also from the Delta Stewardship Council. Present. And I'm not sure, is Randy Fiorini here? No, okay. All right, so at this point, what I'd like to do is take an opportunity to welcome our candidate, Jay Lund. Dr. Lund's research and teaching interests focus on applying systems analysis and economic methods to infrastructure and environmental problems, including policy, planning, and management studies. His work is primarily in water resources and environmental systems engineering, but he has very broad experience, including work on solid and hazardous waste management, dredging and coastal zone management, urban, regional, and transportation planning, and urban ethnography. So Dr. Lund received a PhD in civil engineering and a master's degree in geography from the University of Washington in Seattle. He has over 150 refereed peer-reviewed journal articles in a variety of fields, and many of them include papers and reports and books on California water and the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. He is also an active member of the Delta Independent Science Board. He has served as the chair of the board, as well as, chair-elect and past chair. And he also has a very distinguished record with many awards, including the California Water and Environmental Modeling Forum's Hugo Fisher Award, and in 2018, he was elected to the U.S. National Academy in Engineering. So for the format today, we'll we've allotted about 50 minutes for Dr. Lund's presentation. That will be followed by a short question and answer period. Then we'll take a break, and then for those stakeholders who'd like to stay on, we'll have another 30-minute Q&A session. So, sorry for the long introduction, Jay. I know it's hard to just sit there and wait for me to finish, but at this point, I'd like to call you up to the podium and ask you to begin your presentation, which is entitled Integrated Modeling and Delta Science and Policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. That's going to be the best part of the talk, demonstrating that I have a short attention span. So my purposes today are to sort of give you a little bit of you all know me pretty well. Most of you all know me maybe too well. So I thought I'd try to introduce some new things, some of my research that maybe you haven't seen, some of you haven't seen certainly, and then talk about some ideas for the Delta Science program, this sort of big picture stuff. So I want to point out Delta here is the Ebro Delta. I don't know how many of you followed the news this last week. What happened to the Ebro Delta? It's now subtitled, much of it. So we have a theme in some of the Delta Science Board's work about rapid change for our Delta. This was an unfortunate, very rapid change there, and hopefully it'll come back over time. What I'm going to talk about is sort of science from the perspective of integrated modeling, because my name is Jay Lund and I am a modeler. A little bit about where I came from. I grew up sailing inland and offshore on the East Coast, and I got a bachelor's in international relations and regional planning from the University of Delaware. So I started off as a social scientist. I started off as a political science major, actually, and economics major, partly. And then I went to the University of Washington to become an urban social geographer. I was going to become a professor of geography was my long-term goal. I failed at that goal, although I'm in the geography graduate group, so I can do that now. But I had the most fun master's thesis of anyone ever on the planet. I studied people that lived on sailboats and powerboats in Seattle. And it was an urban ethnography, meaning I had to go interview all those people, and almost every one of them offered me a beer. So I then became an engineer after that experience, just to sober up, I suppose. It was really a fun work, actually. And became an engineer and recycled myself, got a second bachelor's in engineering and a PhD in engineering from the University of Washington. Then 2 weeks after I handed in my dissertation, I came down here to become a professor in civil and environmental engineering here. And my field really is integrated engineering with engineering, economics, and operations research. Mostly around water management, but as you've heard, a few other things. And I've worked on California's system. You might have heard a little bit, read a couple of things I've written. But I've also done modeling work on the Missouri River, the Columbia River system, Panama Canal, South Florida, and a few other places. Most recently, New York City's water system. And I still like to sail, but never sail enough. So some preview of this talk is I want to talk about integrated modeling and some insights to get insights for real water problems and solutions for water problems. And I view this very much in the adaptive management genre that C.S. Hollings came up with in 1978, where the modeling is the central organ that you use to integrate knowledge. It's not a bunch of conversations. It's not just a bunch of workshops. You actually have some really stupid machine that you have to teach what you think is really going on. And then you test that hypothesis over time. A little bit of an example of this with the model that we've developed, UC Davis, a whole bunch of us, over 20 years. And since this is 2020, and we first developed this model in 2001 for a 2020 horizon, I thought it would be interesting to present just how well this model kind of worked, surprisingly. And then the second part of the talk is some thoughts on the Delta Science problem and Delta Science policy. And basically, this is going to fall in the lines of what I think Peter Goodwin established for the direction of this program here. But I'll talk about some of the problems of what I see is brutal incrementalism in a rapidly changing world. Okay, so that's sort of a sub-theme of this. And then as part of talking about that, I want to mention a couple of recent experiences I've had with other basins, particularly how New York City and Chesapeake Bay have been doing their integrated modeling and their management. So some overall thoughts on integrated modeling. First of all, some points. The problems don't care about our disciplines. We are educated in our disciplines. We have to write dissertations in our disciplines, theses in our disciplines. But then once you get out to a real problem, it doesn't care. Your discipline will be useful, but is not sufficient. What can be really important, though, is if you combine your discipline with other disciplines with some discipline. Okay? Have a disciplined way of combining disciplines. This is not just get everybody around a room and talk. There's some structure to that conversation. There's some motivation to that conversation to have some integration and some useful outcome. Systems modeling, I would say as an academic, is a discipline to integrate and test knowledge using computers for problem solving. We're not really trying to understand the science of the problem usually as an engineer. We're trying to figure out, well, what do we know about this problem in terms of what solutions look promising or unpromising? And I see this very much, as I said before, along the lines of C.S. Holling's work. You've all heard the quote about all models are wrong, but some are useful. Again, that's what I'd reiterate here. You really use the modeling and the model process to improve difficult conversations. Right? We're faced with these water problems that have 100 years, 150 years, 200 years of difficult conversations back to the beginning of time. And what we're trying to do is have the modeling to provide some discipline, some idea of what we really know to help improve those difficult conversations, to help us focus our learning and and the modeling, therefore, should reflect both the science and the problems. And by the way, it's never finished. There's a great saying that models are never completed, they're only abandoned. Okay? It's like art. I've said about art too. California's water system. You all are somewhat familiar with it. It's kind of big, it's ugly, it's everywhere, it's got everything. Huge numbers of reservoirs, groundwater, lots of people, and lots of governments. So, when we make a model of it, it looks like this. That's the schematic. You try to get as much in it as you can. This Kelvin model that we've developed has about 50 major surface reservoirs, 30 aquifers, vast conveyance network, huge amounts of probably 8 million acres of, almost 8 million acres of irrigated agriculture, and more than 40 million people in terms of their water demands. The model is called Kelvin. So there's two pictures of Kelvin there, reflecting kind of the personality of this model developed in an academic environment. We can be the mischievous 5-year-old, and those of you that have read Kelvin studies will see some of that. But it's also sort of the religious reformer. We're trying to add some discipline to how we do analysis on these systems, some integration to that. And so when we started off about year 2000 on this, we decided to model the entire intertide system at a time when only the surface water or only the groundwater or parts of them were being modeled. We model supplies and demands. And to keep it sane in our minds, because we're just a bunch of professors and students doing this, we used an optimization model so we didn't have to specify operating rules for every little piece of infrastructure that would just drive you nuts. So what are you optimizing for? Let's say we're going to optimize for economic value. So we have the economic value of water deliveries to agriculture, cities, hydropower, things like that. And then the environment's pretty important. It's so important, we're going to represent that as constraints. You're required to deliver this water for the environment. And the economic uses, they get second dibs in order of economics. Okay? It has all the good and bad things of economics in there. That's fine. This optimization model provides monthly water system operations over 82 years over that whole network. The real value of this, however, is that it forces you to develop an integrated quantitative understanding of the system. The numbers are of secondary importance to what you learn putting the pieces together and trying to convince this really stupid machine that all these pieces fit together. The first time we ran it, it said no feasible solution, which actually I think is the truth. We should have just stopped there, but we did have to systematically debug it, take out all the infeasibilities, and now it gives us feasible solutions that nobody likes. This is just an example of what that schematic looks like just for the Tularia Basin. So you can see it's got a lot of little pieces in there. And so this is wonderful graduate student fodder. And you can see that archiving the data and documenting the data was really important to the longevity of this program. The economics that drive it, we had to have a whole separate set of models for that. And we use the SWAP model. This shows for one region how the monthly economic value functions for water delivery to each of these regions over time. In managing California's water system, there's not one thing we can do. There's hundreds, thousands of different management knobs that we can twiddle and turn and levers to pull. We have lots of local activities that we can do. We have lots of regional and statewide activities to do. We try to represent as many of those in the model as we can. And then what's really important about this is the portfolio. You've been reading from several of the agencies have gotten together to put together a portfolio plan, portfolio policy document for the new administration. That's what this is. We're trying to have an analytical way of coming up with what looks like a promising portfolio. Is it the best portfolio? Probably not. Is it a reasonable portfolio? Yeah, maybe kind of getting close to there, but it's a good point of departure for further discussions. Because otherwise, you're in a 1,000-dimensional dark room. If you don't have an optimization model, you're there with a pen light, looking at one solution at a time. An optimization model, a simulation model is that pen light. An optimization model is a flash bulb. It lets you look at that whole 1,000-dimensional dark space, just a flash, and it tells you, oh, maybe the better solutions look like they're over there or over there. And then you go to those places with your pen light or your discussions or whatever. So optimization model sounds scary, but it's just a flash bulb. Nobody has flash bulbs anymore, right? Okay, so the objectives, first priority, the environmental flows, then economics sorts itself out in the math. We had to orchestrate all the data for hydrology, capacities, environmental flow constraints, values of urban water, agricultural values of water, operating costs, values of hydropower. All that has to be put in the databases along with the metadata, the documentation of that data. We have a solver. Actually, we used to have a solver called HECPRM. Now we have a bigger Python-based solver. And then when the model results come out, we see economic benefits because we have the economics built in the model, costs and benefits. We see the conjunctive use and operation of the cooperative operation of the whole system because the model has been told to cooperate. It doesn't have to get agency changes to legislation. They just do that. It doesn't mean that agencies are actually going to do that, but it says, well, how worthwhile would it be if they cooperated? As an optimization model, an interesting byproduct of it is it gives the incremental willingness to pay for additional water at any location in that network at any month over those 82 years. So we can see what's the water market, value of water markets, potential for water markets across this network between wet years and dry years, all these kinds of things. It has the delivery reliability operations about, what's the frequency distribution of deliveries under this economically ideal operations. We can also constrain the operations to something less than the ideal if there's policies out there that constrain us. We can look at the value of flexible operations by adding and subtracting different policy constraints to an optimization. And then we can also, using the same kind of math that gave us the willingness to pay for additional water and additional reliability, we can also estimate the increase in economic value to the whole system if you have more or less capacity on any piece of conveyance or any bit of storage or any treatment plant in the system. So the real problem with this is you get a big, big pile of numbers, and then you have to sort it out. Jesse is nodding his head. And I have to have you some equations just to prove I'm an engineer. But this is the math. It's really simple math, but there's just a lot of it. And that's why you have computers. So the model results, they give you sort of engineering hydrologic kinds of results, time series, delivery reliabilities, operating costs, and they give you economic results. And this is where you get some synergies from integrated modeling that you don't get if you did the hydrology engineering modeling separate from the economics. You get to see these things together, which is really kind of what people care about. They don't really care about hydrology and the water deliveries for their own sake. Most users in this system care about it largely for economic cases or for the environmental case, and we've got that as well. Anyway, it took us about 5 years to build the first generation of this thing, and so we've used it a bunch of times for lots of different problems throughout the state, and a lot of the PPIC reports have been based on, in part, on these model results. And of course, these are done by lots of students over the last 20 years. I want to touch on a climate warming study we did some time ago, 2004, where you see all the different climate change scenarios. I think if you were to plot up climate change scenarios today, you'd see very similar scatter. You can see the dark line is today's, or it's historical hydrology. You can see the little spring snowmelt bump there. And you see drier and wetter scenarios, all of which have the climate shift with different amounts of temperature change. The kind of responses that come out of the modeling of this was the importance of groundwater storage and conjunctive use. We've kind of seen that recently in the drought, haven't we? Some importance for water market transfers. Remember, this is back in 2004, before the big transfers between Imperial Valley and Metropolitan Water District in San Diego. Economic optimization model, it's no smarter than those real people down there. It says, yeah, this is what you ought to do. A lot of agriculture to urban transfers in the Colorado River Basin and someone in the Central Valley. Some interesting water quality exchanges. I'll talk about one later. And then a lot of flexibility in trading, because we have tremendously variable hydrology here and variable crop prices even between year to year. So having flexibility in the operation of the network is very, very helpful. Probably is also helpful ecologically. We haven't explored that so much. There's some agricultural land fallowing, particularly in the drier scenarios. There's not enough water to go around, and so you tend to take the lowest value agriculture out of production. We might be seeing some of that for a number of reasons. Some new technologies, occasional bits of wastewater reuse and the like. Basically, there's a mix of responses, no silver bullet, but an integrated mix of responses that you can kind of derive analytically, at least to get you in the right ballpark. Just to show that the model comes out with cost, you can see we have a base 2020, statewide water market 2020, and then we have 2100 with wetter and drier and historical hydrologies. I think we had 50 or 90 million people, some huge number of people. And you can see agriculture really gets hit in the dry scenario. Groundwater operations, again, you can see groundwater storage over the period. One thing I really want to point out is, because it's useful, is the time between groundwater storage peaks. Drawdown refill cycle of most reservoirs is a few years, it's a year or a few years going through a drought. When you look at groundwater, it has so much storage down there. We can easily have 15, 20, 60 years drawdown refill. So it's very, very different way to look at things. New water source technologies, here's some results. About 1.6 million acre feet in the dry scenario of additional wastewater reuse. even a little bit of desal in some of the cases. Hydropower generation, you can look at those as results. There's millions of numbers come out of this. I could talk for days about these numbers, and I promise I won't. And then this is one of the last pieces of results that I want to go into. This is what's called the shadow cost of an environmental flow. So if you increase an environmental flow by 1 acre-foot per month, where does that water come from? Sometimes it's just there. It was a wet year. It has no cost to increase that environmental requirement. In dry years, it might come at the cost of some field that has now been partially fallowed, or some additional groundwater pumping that has to be done someplace else in the system. That's what this is. And you can see for each year of the study in the record how that has fluctuated. And what you see is in the dry scenario, we had to go to a completely different scale because it was now affecting very high value crops and urban water uses. But in the other years, it was high, but not horrible. And then this is a set of results sort of illustrating the kinds of what's the economic value of facility capacity changes, both for reservoir storage and different canal conveyance for different climates. So climate's kind of important. Where the infrastructure is important, and what it does is important. Is it conveyance or storage? So overall conclusions from this Calvin effort. First, the value of quantitative analysis. It integrates our scientific understanding, identifies promising portfolios of actions, identifies important things that we don't know, things to worry about. It helps us explore options and impacts, and hopefully it makes the discussions more productive, gives you something to ground the discussions on. Optimization, you could say that all those previous things about a simulation model. Optimization models do a couple of additional things. It helps you explore many different options. It helps you identify promising combinations almost automatically. And the bottom line, I think, is really the most important thing. It helps, integrated modeling helps us learn, or should help us learn if we do it right. It's not, shouldn't be doing out in the corner there someplace. Some model development lessons also from this that I'm not going to go into in the interest of time, but I think there's some lessons for that as well. So the big question, the study I showed you and the previous study that was almost the same for no climate change was done about 2001. It's now 2020. How often in a planning study do you get to test the hypotheses that you did in your first study? And so here's 2020. We did the first modeling for year 2020 demands. Did it work? In terms of water market and transfers, it kind of worked. All the big water transfers that were suggested by the economically driven optimization, hydroeconomic optimization model in 2001 have now been completed. Wow, the model worked. As an academic, I find that amazing because it was just a bunch of us that had never done this before when we just started. One of the results that came out of our 2001 study was it said, you know, East Bay Mud and Contra Costa, they should build an intertie because in wet years, East Bay Mud has a lot of really good quality water and Contra Costa is still pumping from the Delta. It would save Contra Costa a lot of treatment cost if they just took East Bay Mud water. And in dry years, when East Bay Mud doesn't have all the water it wants, Contra Costa has those big Delta pumps and you can do all kinds of trades to get water into the Delta, and then East Bay Mud might not get the water quality they'd like, but they get water. And when we presented that finding, I remember I had to present this finding in front of the head of Contra Costa Water District at the time, a fellow named Wally Bishop. Maybe some of you knew him. He was a kind of a feisty guy. He really didn't like this model result. And so he gave me all kinds of grief about it. The next day, people I knew in both East Bay Mud and Contra Costa emailed me asking for the data. There's an intertie there now. And I was told a few months ago, at the time that I gave that talk, they were starting early discussions on negotiating that intertie. So the model was smarter than I thought. Conjunctive use is active and integrated really across the valley. That's the picture of the intertie, just in case you don't believe me. There's not a huge value of massive amounts of expanded surface storage. And I think finally, and really important, overall flexibility of this system provides a lot of strength. The ability to change your operations between wet years and dry years, different sources, different demands, water transfers, is a tremendous strength. And we certainly saw that in the recent drought. So integrated modeling for California works. I'll return to the Delta. The Delta has a lot of diverse problems, and they overlap with agency missions. Certainly, if an agency, if a problem has one agency with that mission, it's pretty clear. The agency can just do it. You know who to hold responsible. But we have a lot of problems in the Delta that really cross over different agencies' missions. It's regulatory side, project side, different regulatory interests. This is kind of a real challenge for science. And it occurs to me that this is similar to a problem we have at the university. If you take a scientist's view of a problem, or in this case, a Delta science problem, we view it as a network. Oh, you got a problem with zooplankton. Well, you got to go talk to Wim Kimmer over here, and so over in Department of Water Resources, and someone over here in Department of Fish Game, and these other academics here, and here, and we'll get a group of them together and we'll talk. And it's kind of a network, right? Agencies have, and they have to have, more territorial missions. It's sort of like deans at universities. It's not in my one of my departments that I don't care. But the real problems are networks. And so there's no perfect solution to resolving this problem, but it's something we have to struggle with, I think, or struggle against as much as we can. A second problem I see is what I characterized earlier as brutal incrementalism. In the real world, I'm not a believer in revolution. There's a wonderful quote that says, "Revolution is the opiate of the intellectual," and I very firmly believe that. Incrementalism is unavoidable, and it can do pretty well if we're organized and a little bit more forceful about it. But my impression on this system is that incrementalism has become brutally slow and just too small in increments. We're not really able to move things along as fast as they need to happen, given the changes in the system. Go back to that view of the Ebro Delta to motivate you a little bit on that score. Delta is changing faster than science and management can keep up, and the more incremental we are, we have to be incremental, but if we're brutally incremental, we're not going to be able to keep up. We're learning in many tiny bits alone, and slower than the problem stage. So I've got a picture of a gauntlet here. Anybody have to propose things that have to go through many agencies. It's like the university getting something through the academic senate. And then we have sort of a Zeno's paradox of, oh, you got through that increment. Oh, let's make the next increment half as big, and then you never arrive. Our savior, Peter Goodwin, the previous Delta lead scientist, he set a great direction. One Delta, one science. Integrated science planning and activities. The idea of a Delta science plan, science action plans that bring people together. So we've done a good job of establishing that those exist now. But we have to get them out of being brutally incremental. We have to really bring more people on board in bigger steps. And that's a big job. It's hard to do. Part of that, I think, will require integrated modeling, partly because that's what I do. And of course, being a good academic, I think whatever my expertise is, the world needs. But I think in this case, it's actually sort of true. Not for everything. There's a lot of things that aren't modeling science that we need. We need a lot more interagency collaborations and staff development. All the agencies are going through the same problems. They're losing senior staff. They have new people coming in with these responsibilities, but they haven't had time to really come together and come up in it. Well, if you have interagency collaborations, maybe you can bring all these new staff in together educate them all up in the same common problem and the same common approaches, and all get along better because of that. That's sort of a minor delusion of mine. Maybe it's a major delusion. I won't tell. We have to continue to look at science as the middle ground where discussions can occur and we can move forward. Again, taking Peter's lead, pay more attention, continue to pay more attention to science policy interface. Something that Peter, I think, was tremendous at that I'm not going to be as good at. I don't think anybody on earth is as good as he's both effective and nice. I think it's important to be nice as nice as you can, but it's ultimately important to be effective. But Peter is a great example of how you can do both. Bottom line, we must move more firmly in these directions. So some common science for common problems. We have many Delta problems that span several agencies. I think we need to build some multi-party task forces. There's multi-agencies and some non-agency participants to sort of lubricate the process, give some independence to these task forces, both in integrated modeling in several areas, hydrodynamics, water quality, systems operations, perhaps groundwater, but that's outside the Delta, data management expectations, synthesis and review, something that the science program has got a really good start on, and then solution development, maybe comparative solution development to keep it out of the politics a bit. And then try to bring these task force results into the policy discussions. I want to have a few slides now on a couple of other examples where I think they've done some aspects of this. First is New York City's water system. So this is New York City. The green areas are the watersheds that New York City uses to get water. You can see the rest of the Delaware watershed there too. So all these are components of their model, because in running the water system for New York City, they have to be concerned with salinity intrusion in the Delaware River, hundreds of miles away. So it's kind of a big, ugly problem. They've developed something they call the OST, Operation Support Tool, because they use this for operations. Here we have about 6 different systems operations models. Different agencies have different models. Different programs in different agencies have different models. They have one model that's used for operations planning on an hourly time scale to system planning and policy planning on a decadal scale. They'll run them differently, of course, but at least once a year, they'll bring all the modifications that have come out of the different shops using them for different purposes and upgrade the common model. So you get more cross-fertilization, more commonality and understanding of how the system works. It took them about 4 years to develop the initial version of this model, at about $8.5 million. But they revise it annually, and they brought in a bunch of people. One model for everything. Water quality, data systems, all sorts of good things. It's very effective. Second program I want to talk about is the Chesapeake Bay program. This is led by the US EPA, and their modeling program has the goal of stakeholder understanding of the system. Okay. I stole this slide from them. Okay. You want an understandable model with an inclusive process, better and more local input data, and more monitoring data. Okay. I asked them, well, what keeps this from just fragmenting into a model that you never show the public because you've never gotten every stakeholder to buy in on every little detail? And they say, well, we have a timeline, and the model will be released and be used on that politically driven timeline. And that enforces some discipline, enforces some simplifications in the movement of that model. And then you can always improve that model later for the next timeline. You will complete those model results on that timeline. And that, I think, is the key to it. It's EPA money keeps everybody in line. And here's their larger model. It's got rainfall runoff, atmospheric deposition, transport of all sorts of things, nutrients and the like, across all kinds of land uses and BMPs, into the water, into the 3D hydrodynamic models, water quality models of the system, all the way down. Look at things. Amazing. And they developed this model, they say, includes everyone. They have lots of different work groups involving lots of different agencies and independent review folks to vet every component of the model so long as it's done on that timeline. And they have a group called, they call it STAC, Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee. It has 41 academic and agency members. And they said they carefully developed that advisory committee so it has enough independent sort of academic and independent members so that it's not just what the agencies can agree on. It has enough independent oomph to it to navigate those waters a little more flexibly. So back to some directions for the program here, perhaps. Try to organize science and policy discussions a bit more. We tend to focus, as academics particularly, our academic backgrounds hinders us often in terms of policy making. We tend to concentrate on things we don't know. Things we don't know are certainly important, but for real decision making, you also have to have some faith in things you do know. Often we have sufficient knowledge to make a reasonably good decision, and then we can look at the uncertainties as what other contingencies should we prepare for? So you're not neglecting uncertainties, but you're not letting them hold you back. You're not using them as an excuse not to make a decision. And so I think an important aspect of the future work around here for this system and other systems is to talk about really the first order uncertainties, the things that help us develop a common understanding of the problem in the system. And then to communicate this across agencies, across interests, so we have some common ability to talk about things. I've seen this when I was in the Netherlands talking about, trying to learn about how they do flood risk analysis. If you have a discussion here about floods, everybody's on a different page. Everybody's talking about something completely different. If you go to the Netherlands, of course, they've had this problem for 150 years. Everybody talks about flood risk analysis. Enviros talk about flood risk. Agency people, the engineers, everybody's got the same kind of framework. They'll disagree about things, that's fine, but their disagreements occur within a framework that everybody kind of understands. It helps the conversation around and makes things a little more cost effective. And so I think we need to organize and more coherently inform policymakers. Implementation, again, how to do this. Peter Goodwin's lead, set a common direction with persistent incremental progress in as big a steps as you think you can get away with, but make the progress in bigger increments than we've been doing lately. Cross-agency efforts, staff development, as I mentioned, is really important in all of this. Develop a coherent core. We have to start from a core of things we know and build out. If you start from all the things we don't know and try to build in, I think it's just too much entropy going on. I think we have to have a little broader science appreciation for the elected officials, for the agencies, for the higher level agency folks, for the legislative staff and the like. If they're not going to fund it if we can't explain it to them, if they don't have an appreciation for it. And so I think we need to have pretty regular and maybe a little bit more organized around the core of knowledge, the core problems, science and policy discussions. So conclusions, we know a lot about this system. There's a lot we don't know too. And we need to know more and make it known. All of our science and work needs to be focused on the problems and solutions, some of which will involve fundamental research. Cross-agency, cross-party organization is really important to helping us all know more together, helping us be more effective in working with policymakers and managers. And it's not just us communicating with them, the policymakers, it's them also being better organized to digest science. So the science appreciation becomes important. It sort of takes two sides to have a conversation. We're not particularly good about purging ourselves of jargon and the like, but sometimes the processes that we're trying to help might be tweaked to digest the stuff that we produce. So that's the end of my talk. I like Bruegel.
A few announcements. So for this portion of the presentation, we'll have some Q&A with Jay about his presentation. And we have people here in the room, thank you all, and we also have people who are participating by WebEx from remote locations. So we'll start with questions from the audience, and then we'll turn to the WebEx questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and someone from the staff will bring a microphone to you so that everybody can hear your question. Thank you. So I'll just turn it over to you to answer.
Yes. This is my qualifying exam.
Yes.
Yeah, hi Jay, this is Mike Chakowski, USGS. I appreciated your comments about science appreciation and the importance of connecting with policymakers and the legislature. And this is an area where I know you know a lot of the policymakers because of your career work here. What are your thoughts on how that increased science appreciation on the part of policymakers might be achieved?
Persistence is a necessary condition. I mean, I was told by a wise professor many years ago that in this planning business, you have to accept that most of the time you will fail. I think this is also true in science policy communications. Most of the time you're going to fail. And a lot of the time you're just preparing, trying to establish lines of communications for when a flood, drought, or lawsuit come up and when they're really interested in paying attention to you. So you have to be persistent. That's the main thing. I think building it around a core of things we do know is a lot better conversation than talking about uncertainties, because decision makers don't want to hear what you don't know. They want to hear what you know. We're scientists. We're supposed to know stuff. Sometimes we know that we don't know perfectly, but we do know some things that are useful for them.
Hi, Jay. Mike sort of prefaced this question, and you began to respond quite meaningfully to what I'm about to ask. I know you've been a player in these discussions for many years, as you described. To sort of just get to the point, like the frustrations that you've described are bountiful. What makes you drawn to that now in your career? Why do you want to persist?
A moth to a flame.
I just want to hear a little bit about what excites you about that, I think.
It's kind of the ultimate challenge, for an academic. I've had an unexpectedly productive career. I've kind of been successful in doing this from the outside. When this job has opened up in the past, I've usually thought, well, I think at this point I can still be more effective at informing policy from the outside than from the inside. Maybe if I get inside, I'll run away screaming. But maybe I can be useful. I like to be useful, and if at this point I can be useful, that's really the most interesting thing to me. The people of California have paid me for 33 years now to do good things, and this is just another continuation of that.
when you're talking about developing kind of a common core of scientific things, things that we know, if you look at discussion, my first thought went to climate change, but there's kind of, you see an attack on what we think, if you ask a scientist, oh, this is a common core of something we know, and we just kind of treat it as given, but you see it as an attack kind of thing, like, no, actually what you thought of as a common core is not in fact common. So I kind of look at it as how can we, sometimes the approach that we have is, if we just throw data at people, if we just show them how good the models are, how good our understanding is, they'll understand. And sometimes it seems like the reverse is true, and that makes people fight back less. So do you have any suggestions or thoughts about how we as scientists might be able to communicate that information better?
Sure. Show them the data and your model results and explain it in terms of their checkbook, their car, and their house. Because they can understand their checkbook, their car, and their house. And if they can see the similar logic between that and what you're talking about, it increases the absorption capacity immensely. And if you can make a joke, it's even better. Self-deprecating joke, even better.
Hi, Jay. Enjoyed your talk. Thanks. Brian Bergamaschi, USGS. So you're suggesting, I think, that this integrated modeling approach can be improved and offer great benefit to the system. I have kind of a two-part question. And the first part of the question has to do with the economic analysis side of it. And, it's pretty famously problematic to evaluate environmental outcomes using economic models. And I'm wondering what kind of thought went into the process, well, and social outcomes as well, societal outcomes. How you develop and then defend those when you're talking to people within the context of the model. And the second part of the question is that, for example, the New York, as I understand what you were managing to as an endpoint in the New York example, was this salinity intrusion in the lower Delaware River, if I got that right. And then
so they're really more concerned with turbidity in Keswick Reservoir, which is their intake to New York City. But anyway.
Okay, but I guess I would like your thinking on what the endpoints that we can reasonably approach with a model like you're describing for the Delta system.
Again, this is an imperfect process. Any analysis, any science is imperfect, right? And everyone with a PhD is basically trained as an assassin of anybody else's science. So that's the environment we live in. You're all trained assassins. You know that at some level. If you've ever reviewed somebody else's paper or had a paper reviewed, there's lots of trained assassins out there. In our modeling of the California system, we had a really interesting discussion and a very important decision early on. There were a bunch of academic economists that said, well, you shouldn't represent environmental flows as constraints. You should have contingent valuation studies of the economic value of those flows for ecosystem services. We thought about it, okay, yeah, we could take that flow in that stream at that month and say, change in that flow will produce so many more salmon or so many more smelt. And then we have a societal value on each salmon or each smelt of another dollars per fish. Intellectually, mathematically, I can see that. If I put that into a model and then I present the results, what's everybody going to talk about? Why did you pick that value for the fish? And why did you pick that production function for the fish as a function of flows? That's not a useful discussion. The purpose of the model was to help people think about operating the system. So it was just far easier to say, okay, we're going to give this much water to the fish. It's a constraint. They get their water first. If you think that number is too low, we can raise it and see what it does to the rest of the system. And it seemed like you have to, I think, organize problems, science problems, analytical problems, so that they can be solved. We have a lot of people organizing problems in ways, discussing problems in ways, in a framework where you'll never get a solution out of it, right? There's abundant empirical examples, I think. Our luxury as scientists, certainly at a university, is to cast the problem in a way where we think we can provide some insights. And in that particular case, it seemed to us pretty clear that if we cast it in the way that the ecosystem service economists wanted us to cast it, that the discussion wasn't going to be helpful for the problem of managing the system. It would all become about the details of the model. The details of the model should not be important. I mean, they are important. I certainly understand that. But for the discussion, you want to help the discussion move along. You don't want to set up the model and the analysis and the science to encourage getting lost in the weeds. So that's my sort of philosophical perspective on that subject. Endpoints?
Yeah, the modeling endpoints here.
I think it's got to be driven by the problem. What do people think the problem is that you're trying to solve? I mean, there's sort of a social compact, right, between science and the society, the social contract for science, that they pay us, we give them insights. Right? If we don't give them insights to their problem, they probably are going to send us less money maybe someday eventually. So the way that they see the problem helps us define the endpoints. For most of the water used in California, the endpoint for most of the diversions is economics, which is why we built the model mostly around economics. And for the city of New York, they have some endpoints that some of their regulators are interested in, which is salinity on the Delaware River. But their primary endpoint, if you will, objective in the model, is turbidity for the most part, going into their UV disinfection plant before it gets delivered to 9 million people.
Hi, Jay. Jessica Law from the Delta Stewardship Council. Just a question. Here we are, 2020. Hindsight is 2020. When you think about the Calvin model and think back about sort of lessons learned from that model, can you think of ways where you would have changed what you did to effectively communicate the results of that model in order to better affect the trajectory of water system improvements? And when you think about those lessons learned, how would you take some of those lessons learned and apply it here in the Delta system now when you're thinking about integrated modeling going forward?
That's a really good question. I mean, we had the luxury in 2001 of developing this model from an academic perspective. We had money from the state to do this, from the resources agency to do it. They were interested in what's the value of, would investors be willing to pay to help us expand capacities in different parts of the system? The answer is mostly no. But we get all these other collateral benefits. When we started to do this modeling, people were kind of interested, but they didn't think it could be done. And so I think they didn't pay much attention to us. It's probably still true today. They just can't believe this can be done. It's done all the time. So we could be a little bit more of the mischievous 5-year-old Calvin than the religious reformer Calvin. If you were, say, the Department of Water Resources and you wanted to do it today, maybe this would explain why you don't do it, you just get nothing but grief from an optimization model that said what to do. So I think you'd have to do this as part of a bigger process that involved multiple agencies, give you a little bit more cover, have enough independent people so that you can blame them for it too, and then put it in a bigger context that addresses some of the other environmental issues and local land use issues and environmental justice issues that would come up with the use of this model. So you'd have to, I think, make it a little bit bigger problem in order to organize the insights and supplement it with additional insights, which might be something what a science program might do.
Kate Melanson, part of the Delta Stewardship Council over here as a California Sea Grant Science Fellow. And I feel like most of the issues kind of relates to Jessica's question. Most of the issues you were talking about are really science communication issues, some of them. And since we have a science communication unit here, I was kind of wondering what you see as a vision for science communication moving forward to address these issues, not only in the science program, but in the council as a whole, and then partially is bringing all these agencies together. How do you see that working?
We've made a really big, collectively in the community of scientists around the Delta in California, we've made a really big leap into science communications, and I think it's been very, very helpful, very good for us as scientists to think about what's important and how we're going to communicate it. Where I think we've not taken full advantage of that is to think about how do we orchestrate the messages. There's some common core to the messages that we want to get across, some common perspective, some common framework that we want to get the decision makers to understand. We don't want to just communicate, oh, so-and-so found this thing in their study and so-and-so found that thing in their study. And, this is how we tend to do most science communication. I write a paper, my science communication person writes something. No, we got a bigger thing for these policymakers to think about. And in fact, if we give them lots of weeds, they're going to be confused with us. So I think to some degree, the hardest part and the most important part is giving them a more coherent framework to understand science and to put the pieces together so that they have the impression that we kind of understand something about what we're doing here and that they have a role in it that can help, this common framework can help them think through what are very difficult problems for them. And if you're a policymaker, agency head, or elected official in this system, you've got hundreds of different masters out there that are all throwing tomatoes at you and things like that. If you can buy into a common understanding of the problem and directions for some of the solutions, I think it helps. It helps everybody. It helps direct our science as well. Andrew?
Andrew Schwartz, Delta Stewardship Council. So in your remarks, you talked about needing to, make bigger, faster, incremental changes to keep up with what's happening on the ground. And you also talked about integrated modeling and more integration and more coordination. And, I often come to, the old saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. But I think those two things, kind of eventually push against each other, right? We have to go fast and we have to go far. So how do you think about balancing those two factors and getting the kind of the right mix?
I think that's a really good question. For Chesapeake Bay, they had a mandate from the federal legislation with EPA and had EPA money that said, here's a set of timetables that you have to have for your regulations and your TMDLs. You got, and we're going to give you a structure so you have to move forward together to do it. But if you want to go slowly, getting everybody to spontaneously organize is a really good way to go slowly. And sometimes I fear that we have used consensus kind of words as an excuse for not doing anything controversial or important. You can see a lot of, so we have water action plans, we have a lot of non-action plans.
Jay, Mike Hardesty. I guess you're starting to answer the question I think that's important here, and that in a broad sense. Well, just to set the stage, there's well over 500 water agencies in the state. Obviously, everyone, you touched on the fact that they all are territorial, and as one might expect.
They have to be.
They have to be.
It's the law.
And they're also have different authorities and different inventories of things based upon when they were formed and how they do that. So my question is a little broader, and it is, what's the currency that actually makes a plan work here? Is it political muscle? Is it dollars? Is it just convincing people it's a good idea to do these things, which has not actually worked well, in recent years. I mean, all these agencies, and I must admit I was part of that. I mean, we're very adept at stopping things. So how do we what's the currency that makes this thing move?
When I first was thinking about applying for this job, I talked to someone and said, well, one of the things that has me worried the most is I'm coming into an environment that's very good at saying no. Sort of that gauntlet of no that almost everyone runs into here. And I think you have to have, well, in the case of EPA, Chesapeake Bay, they had federal legislation and money and mandate to do it on time altogether. If you didn't do it altogether, then EPA, sort of like with the Delta agreement back in the 1990s, then the EPA could come in and do it by itself. Nobody in the states wants that. So that's one kind of way to do it. You orchestrate some need to converge in a timely way, and a framework for bringing people along. What happens if you don't do that? Well, you're either stuck with brutal incrementalism, or you're stuck with brutal incrementalism in most areas, and you pick a few areas where you say, I think these people in these agencies are ripe for making progress in this area. And that's where we should invest. And then we're going to rely partly on the good example of hopefully some success there to bring other people along. Or maybe we'll have a flood or a drought or a lawsuit that'll force everybody to come together. That sometimes happens in the system. I tell my students all the time that often in the system you'll spend 10 years of your career doing studies, talking to people, and then when you get a flood, drought, or lawsuit, and then they're really interested in what you have to say. And then at that point, you know what to tell them, you know who to talk to, you know how to talk to them, those kinds of things. So it's an imperfect world, and we just have to, it's going to be incremental. It's not going to be magic. It's not going to be revolution. It's going to be incremental. We're going to perceive it as brutally incremental, but we ought to be able to do better than we're doing now.
Lindsay Kameyer with the Office of the Delta Water Master. Hi, Jay. In your presentation, you mentioned that the Delta is changing faster than science and management can keep up with. As the lead scientist, how do you propose dealing with that issue?
I'm going to outlaw all change. Yeah, I think you have to move faster. A lot of this change is exogenous. It's new invasive species show up. Climate is changing. Changes in the price structure of crops all over the state. New enlisted species, all kinds of things. So we can't stop change. All we can do is organize ourselves to be better prepared for it and to better respond to it. And I think science ought to have sort of a vanguard role in that, because we ought to be able to sort of tease out what those changes are. The most important of those changes. There will always be tremendous uncertainties about what those changes are, but we kind of know what most of them are qualitatively and in some general orders of magnitude of how big they're likely to be. That's what we got to prepare for. Okay.
We have no written questions online at this point.
Okay. We've exhausted you.
So right now, before we do anything else, let's just thank Jay for a very informative and valuable presentation. Okay, so we will take a break for about 10 minutes and reconvene at 12:10. And at 12:10, we'll have a meet and greet opportunity with the Delta lead scientist applicant, Jay Lund, where we'll have an opportunity for stakeholders to ask more questions related to his role in the position rather than his presentation today. So thank you, everyone.